Hey, it's Cara here. I'll be joined by Ben, and we're going to talk about how Extinction Rebellion works to tackle all the scary climate stuff you just heard about. So, Extinction Rebellion was formed in October 2018 when British activists, organized by the group Rising Up, assembled in Parliament Square in London to announce a declaration of rebellion against the UK government. Over the following few weeks, 6,000 rebels, as we call ourselves, converged in London to peacefully block five major bridges across the Thames River. There were other actions as well, including the planting of trees in the middle of Parliament Square, and rebels even supergluing themselves to the gates of Buckingham Palace as they read a letter to the Queen. The call to rebel against business as usual grew global, and the next week, groups popped up all over Europe and the US. Today, with over 60 US chapters and over 1,000 chapters worldwide, Extinction Rebellion is global and active in 6 continents.
Hey everyone, Ben here. We've met a couple times now, I think. I'm the one whose voice sounds like this. So, at this point, you might be wondering, what exactly does Extinction Rebellion want to see happen? Well, here in the United States, Extinction Rebellion has 4 demands, and we are organizing to meet these 4 demands. The first of which is tell the truth. We demand that the government must tell the truth about the climate and wider ecological emergency and must work alongside the media to communicate the urgency for change, including what individuals, communities, and businesses must do. Number 2, act now. We demand that the government must enact legally binding policies to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025 and take further action to remove the excess of atmospheric greenhouse gases. It must cooperate internationally so that the global economy runs on no more than half a planet's worth of resources per year, and it must reverse all policies not in alignment with that position.
The third demand is the creation of a citizens' assembly in the respective country of each chapter. Most governments and politicians worldwide have not taken meaningful action towards carbon neutrality or sustainable climate policies, so we're bringing the power to the people for a safer future. Our fourth demand is a transition to carbon neutrality that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, indigenous people, people from the global south, and poor people for years of environmental injustice, establishes legal rights for ecosystems to thrive and regenerate in perpetuity, and repairs the ongoing ecocide to prevent extinction of human and all species in order to maintain a livable, just planet for all. Now, why 2025 in particular? Many governments use 2050 as a target for zeroing emissions. And 2050 is comfortably far enough in the future that it lets current governments do basically nothing from an optics standpoint. Waiting that long will be devastating for the climate and for us. By waiting until 2050, like imagine you're in a car and you see you're going towards a cliff. Would you say, "Oh, there's a cliff," and keep on driving? No, you would slam on the brakes immediately because your brakes might not work, or they might not be as good as you thought they were, or just because there's no going back from driving off a cliff and you want to live. That's the position we're in at the moment. We are heading towards a climate cliff.
Now, why is our third demand for a citizens' assembly? What is a citizens' assembly? A citizens' assembly is a group of people who are brought together to discuss an issue and reach a conclusion about what they think should happen. So this is a quote from the parliament.uk website and is a fairly broad definition, but it does get to the heart of what a citizens' assembly is all about. Essentially, it is a group of ordinary citizens who have been selected and brought together to consider and discuss at length an issue, and then to make recommendations to the government to take action on that issue. Here in the US, we have quite a few examples of organizations working on citizens' assemblies, some with slight variation, citizens' juries and citizens' initiative reviews being 2 examples. I would encourage you to look into the work being done by the Jefferson Center in Minneapolis and Healthy Democracy in Portland as two such examples. So, how is a citizens' assembly formed? It turns out it's a pretty structured process. The assembly is a set of people who have been selected on the basis of their demographics to make sure that they're representative of the population. They convene, they hear evidence from experts, experts that they have been offered, but also experts that they have chosen to consult. And they hear from stakeholders, people to whom this issue matters. They also read submissions from the public, so the public have a chance to feed into this process as well. And then they get together and they discuss, in small groups and also collectively, with the evidence and the submissions and everything else, what they think should be done. Finally, they make a formal document that lays out what they think should be done, and they present that to the government, and the government reviews it and implements it. The reason that this is a demand that we have is that it gets around some of those problems of democracy that we mentioned earlier. Democracy in its current form is all too often short-termist. Many politicians work primarily to get reelected, as opposed to working for their constituencies, the people. A citizens' assembly can take the long view because they're not dependent on votes, so they can sit down and they can ask the really hard questions. For example, what is it that we need to do, painful though it may be, to secure a future for our children? And then their work is able to focus and hone in on potential steps to address these long-term questions. They're also free from corporate influences. One of the huge problems with government today is that they rely on very, very wealthy donors, often enormous corporations. They have to keep business happy so that they can get reelected, and that limits to a great extent some of the things that they should be able to do. Particularly, for example, if you want to rein in the fossil fuel industry, which we absolutely need to do. Citizens' assemblies are also representative of the population, and for that reason, they're trusted by the public and perceived to be unbiased. And finally, citizens' assemblies have worked very well in the past, on a number of occasions. For example, Ireland called a citizens' assembly to discuss the very, very difficult issue of abortion that it's wrestled with for a long time. And the recommendation that they made, which was to liberalize abortion laws, was then put to a referendum. And the vote of the people was almost identical to the vote of the Citizens' Assembly. So it really was very representative of those people's views. And then that was enacted into law.
So, how does Extinction Rebellion work on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis? First of all, the most important thing to know about Extinction Rebellion is that we are nonviolent. None of our public actions or internal actions or relationships are to be violent in any way. Also, Extinction Rebellion is completely decentralized. As we talked about before, Extinction Rebellion started in the UK and has chapters all over the world, but it is not a hierarchical organization. XR is decentralized and self-organized. What does that mean? Decentralization means that no chapter is in charge of another. Each chapter is an independent entity, allowed to operate officially under the Extinction Rebellion name as long as it follows the principles and demands. Additionally, power is also decentralized within each XR chapter. So, how does it work? Well, each chapter has multiple working groups, such as finance, member integration, action, and more. And each working group creates their own mandate, which outlines their full scope of responsibilities and authority. Working group coordinators attend separate meetings to update the rest of the chapter and to coordinate the groups. However, each meeting, whether it's a working group meeting or a coordinator meeting, is open to everyone else in the chapter, and the minutes of each meeting are accessible to all members. Additionally, the facilitators, note keepers, and timekeepers are rotated for each meeting, and everyone can contribute to the meeting agendas. And when we do have to make decisions, they are made by consensus within each working group and within the chapter as a whole, if necessary. Another important thing to know about Extinction Rebellion is that we have what we call a regenerative culture. So each chapter aims to cultivate a regenerative culture both within the chapter itself and in its work with others outside of Extinction Rebellion. At its core, a regenerative culture is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. In this way, it functions like a flourishing ecosystem. Each chapter has a regenerative culture, or regen, working group to help install and maintain a regenerative culture within the chapter. Regen's work can take many forms, including supporting rebels before, during, and after actions, promoting healthy and effective relationships and processes within the chapter and with collaborators, and helping people work with their emotions surrounding the climate crisis. A regenerative culture is anti-racist, anti-oppression, and always growing and evolving.
And our core activities are actions. These are the things that aim to cause disruption and to get us to the notice of the powers that be, but more importantly to the notice of the wider public. The key components of our actions, harkening back to some of the elements of civil resistance we talked about earlier, are that they are nonviolent, disruptive, regenerative, and fun. Some of the actions are conceived and planned locally. For example, a common thing that local groups will do is something called a die-in. You can see the picture on the left-hand side of the screen is a die-in we did in Jackson Square. This is where people will get together in a public space and feign being dead to make a couple points. One, to make the point that what we are looking at is an existential threat to humanity. But also, we included gravestones with ways people have already and are expected to die due to the effects of the climate crisis, to illustrate that this has been happening and continues to happen around the world today. For many people, it is already an existential threat. And then people had to step over us and step around us. They had to interact with this picture, this reality, and come to terms with it. On the right, this is part of an ongoing series of actions we've done outside and recently inside various Chase banks around the city as part of the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition, drawing attention to how massive financial institutions fund the climate crisis and intersecting systems of injustice. Some actions are conceived and planned internationally. So this was part of a huge global week of rebellion done before Extinction Rebellion New Orleans even existed. And this picture is from central London. And as you can see, they can be, the actions, and we believe they should be, very creative, dragging this huge pink boat into central London and setting up shop for the week. Now, this point here is one of ongoing discussion and evolution, and it's a really important point. We recognize the complexities of participating in an arrestable action, and by no means is it required to participate in Extinction Rebellion or even in Extinction Rebellion actions. This is why it's really important to participate in nonviolent direct action trainings and to prepare and plan as much as possible before participating in an action that might carry a risk of arrest. Furthermore, in Louisiana, as well as in many states around the country, we have a blatantly anti-protest, anti-democratic, quote, critical infrastructure bill. This bill was drafted in 2018 specifically in response and targeting indigenous activists protesting the Bayou Bridge pipeline. Many offenses that used to qualify as misdemeanors are now felony charges. So to that point, we must center the reality that the color of our skin directly influences our relationship to law enforcement. It is imperative, and I cannot stress this enough, that we continue to do the work to engage with systemic and structural racism and actively participate in the processes of undoing these systems, both in ourselves and in society at large. Our actions must continue to evolve accordingly and take this work into account every step of the way. We cannot effectively organize on a large scale or a small scale without doing this work.